How do you tell the story of a church that's been in existence for 134 years? I decided through history and through memory. The earliest history that I read of the church indicated that on a very stormy April in 1883, 30 people gathered in the room of the storehouse that belongs to Samuel McCrea, which is right next door to the church building. The pastor from the Mount Bethel Church came and led the service. He was a student at Centenary Collegiate College, which is in Hackettstown. This did not go without some conflict because the Anderson Church, which is a mere mile to the south of this building, the pastor of that church felt that someone was infringing on his property, his territory. The hierarchy of the Methodist Church decided that the pastor from the Anderson Church would be assigned also to Port Murray Church. And this assignment continued from 1883 until 1892. At that time, the congregation then became apart. Mount Bethel and Port Murray shared a minister from 1892 through 1969. During the period of time that the Anderson pastor was working with this congregation, they had revival meetings with the Baptists, who also had a church here in Port Murray. And some of the people from that church began to flow into the congregation in Port Murray. After a period of time in the early 1890s, they decided they wanted a church. They wanted some place that they could have a real worship service and a fellowship hall. Conversation went on. It was deemed to be a good idea. Sam McCrea owned the lot that was right next door to the storehouse, and he donated that along with $1,000 towards the church building. And the group of people went to work and they began raising funds. They raised through the various organizations that had formed within the church. People from Mount Bethel assisted through their Epworth League and their Sunday school. Individuals made contributions. And by June of 1895, the church was erected and a cornerstone was laid. The history tells that when the cornerstone was being dedicated, it again was a very stormy day, but the rains held off until after the stone was laid. And then they had torrents of rain. From then, the people started to work hard to raise the rest of the money they needed for the church. In December of 1895, they had a dedication service. The service was an all-day affair. They had 3 different services. At the morning service, they had announced at the close of the service that there was a debt of $730 yet for the building. And people reached into their pockets. Sam McCrea himself reached in, donated $1,000, and they proceeded to raise some funds. Well, Sam McCrea, he gave his $1,000 previously, but they raised several $100s at that service. In the afternoon, they held another church service. Again, at the end of the service, the debt was declared to be $400 and some. And by the time they had their evening service, the debt was $200. And that amount of money was raised in a very short period of time. And the church wound up being debt-free. At that time, the value was $5,000 in construction. It's quite reasonable to today's standards. Stained glass windows are the most beautiful windows, I think, in many, many churches around. In probably around the late 1970s, early 1980s, we had an appraisal done on the windows for insurance purposes. And the company that did the appraisal valued them at $75,000. Indicating that although they couldn't find no indication of them having been Tiffany windows, they certainly were Tiffany-like with the jewels that are in them and the fantastic work that was done. They are dedicated to the three in the front or behind the pulpit are dedicated to the three earliest pastors who served the church. Other pastors are named in the various groups that provided funds for the windows, individuals and groups. According to the rolls of the church, there were 75 pastors who served from between 1883 and 2016 when the church was closed. Of those, 3 were returning pastors. Dr. Joseph Blessing was a pastor in, I believe, the 1930s. He returned again in the early 1960s, and yet again as a visiting pastor later in the 1960s. The second pastor who was a repeat was Reverend Stanley Tiller, and he was here both in the 1930s and 1940s. The members of this church are varied. When you look at the rolls over the years, you see the name of Park. Dr. Joseph Park, who played the organ as long as probably anyone can remember, from in his teens until he passed away in 1970. He indicated that he remembered the laying of the cornerstone in 1895. His family lived here. His mother, Mamie Park, was an integral part of the church, and she serves the church well. The names of people who have been involved, as I say, the Parks, the Rushes, the Sauks, the Marlatts, Wilkinson and Snover and Kreis and Feller. I know I forget many, many of them. The Marlatts were a very, very integral part of the church. Bigelows. We all worked hard. We had a good time in this church. Over the years, there was a great Sunday school in the church. As the congregation grew and the children grew, of course, it changed. But in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there were a lot of children who came to the Sunday school. I can remember as a Sunday school student myself, standing over here in the front of the church with Kate McMurray sitting there looking at me while I recited the names of the books of the Bible that she insisted we all learn. And we had a good time. As times changed, mobility changed, people came and went more often, and it was more difficult to maintain a Sunday school. The families grew, but the children became involved in sports and other activities, and mobility was so different. So people went further away or were doing other things on Sundays, so we just didn't have those opportunities, and Sunday school eventually became a thing of the past around here, sadly. Over the years, the Sunday school did a lot of things. We had Christmas program, we had Sunday school programs, dedications in June. At Christmas time, one of the great things that we loved to do, and everybody joined, and it wasn't just the kids, but we would decorate the front of the church, decorate the railing with boughs and ribbons. And we had one of the men from the church build a large wreath for the center portion, lined it or filled it with chicken wire, and we would weave boughs of pine, long needle white pine through it. So the one year that we did that, I had gotten the key from Mamie Park, who lived right up the street, and I took it up to her, returned the key, and Mamie couldn't see well at that time. And as I walked into the door and walked over to greet her, she said, "Oh, you've brought Christmas to me. I can smell Christmas." I always remembered that. It really made me feel good, made me feel that we as a church were stretching out. It was fun. Earlier, I spoke about the cornerstone that was laid in 1895. In 1995, we had a 100th year anniversary. And of course, a part of that was taking the cornerstone apart. And when the items were taken out, and we still have them, or I still have them, it was nothing more than probably a small Bible and a prayer book and newspaper articles but everything was so terribly deteriorated that you can't even handle it, leave alone see what was in it. And that was a shame, because I'm sure that in 1885 or 95 they preserved what was important at that time. When the current cornerstone was laid, or when we finished with the 1995 service, copies of the programs, I believe even computer discs with maybe some pictures, were put in. There was talk of sealing them in vacuum sealed plastic, the way that you do, and then there was a Tupperware container that the things were put in, and it sits behind where the original cornerstone was, and I believe is more accessible from the inside of the church than through the cornerstone. But unfortunately, all of the ways of preserving were not known, certainly in 1895, to preserve things, so they kept. The organ in this church is a beautiful piece of equipment. You know, it looks very grand and glorious, but it is not a pipe organ. It is a pump organ. At one time in the very early days, there was usually a younger person who sat and pumped the air into the diaphragm or whatever operates the organ, so the organist could play. Eventually it was electrified so that that person did not have to exercise his legs so much. But it is a grand and glorious piece of equipment. However, it's not quite what it appears to be. Some of the repairs that took place here at the church, one time lightning struck the bell tower, and that had to be refurbished and reslated. And I know that the pastor at the time was speaking with a pastor from another church, not directly connected with this area, and that church promptly donated $15,000 towards the repair of the steeple. And then over the years, the original slate on the church began to deteriorate, and it was decided, well, let's see if we could do a new roof. And Dale Coleman, who was very active in the church at the time, his family was always a part of the church. Eleanor especially, she was very active in all of the work and helping with the dinners, planning the dinners. Dale Coleman decided that he would pay for the slate, and he purchased slate for the entire roof, and it was constructed, and there is a plaque in the front area of the church that has Eleanor's name on it, and it was dedicated to her. So when I think about the Coleman family, they lived right down around the corner from the church. And Eleanor, as I say, she was always doing things, always very, very helpful. And she was very instrumental in seeing that we always had fresh flowers in the church, especially during the summer when flowers were just a bloom in her garden, and she would cut them and bring them up every Sunday and adorn the church. She was greatly missed when she passed away. with all of the things that have taken place in this church, in this community over the last 134 years, to me, one of the saddest is the fact that during the 2016, it was determined that the congregation no longer was adequate, no longer could continue the way we were, and with the blessings of those who were still here, conference determined it was time to close the McCrea United Methodist Church. In June, the church was officially closed in May during the church conference. And in June of 2016, a final service was held here. The church was packed with people. Having gone from a congregation that was down to 10, 12 people, we had a membership left of 16. However, 4 of them no longer lived in the area. Another 3 or 4 of them were too ill to ever come back out to church, and not many of the rest of us came. But on June the 12th of 2016, this church was filled with people. We had one lady who came, got herself a chair and put it here in the choir loft. And she sat there and she said, when I was a kid in this church, I sang in this choir, and this is where I remember being. So that's where she was for the entire service. Pastors from the previous pastors came. Excuse me. They all spoke. District superintendent was here. It was a very, very nice service. It was a very fitting service, and the church was formally closed at that time, June 12th, 2016. Probably one of the fondest memories I have of our Sunday school and the activities of the church probably sums up just about everything that there is to know about the church. It was a Children's Day service, and the program that was developed had each student talking in some manner about the various parts of the church. The crown in the window, the cross, the communion table, the baptismal font, hymnals, Bibles, all of those things that are part of the church. But the last student, what she had to say was that we've talked about everything that exists here, and that you see and think about every Sunday when you come. But as you get up and leave this church, you are leaving a building. The church goes with you. And to that I say, amen.